The winter of 1887 hit the Montana Territory harder than anyone could remember. Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets for days on end, transforming the vast prairie into an endless white desert. The wind howled like wounded wolves across the plains, and temperatures plummeted so low that even the hardiest ranchers stayed close to their fires. It was the kind of winter that tested a person's will to survive, the kind that separated those who belonged to the land from those who didn't. On the outskirts of Silver Creek, a small settlement that barely qualified as a town, stood the grandest ranch for 100 miles in any direction. The Double R Ranch belonged to Robert "Buck" Richardson, a man whose legend had grown as large as his fortune. Buck had arrived in Montana 20 years earlier with nothing but a horse, a rifle, and an iron determination to carve out something of his own from the wilderness. Through shrewd cattle deals, wise investments, and an uncanny ability to predict where the railroads would expand, he'd transformed himself from a dusty cowpuncher into one of the wealthiest men in the territory. His ranch sprawled across 15,000 acres, his herds numbered in the thousands, and his mansion stood like a monument to the American dream, its windows glowing warm against the frozen landscape. But wealth hadn't softened Buck Richardson. At 52, he still rose before dawn, still checked on his cattle personally during the worst weather, still lived by the code of the Old West even as civilization crept closer each year. His weathered face told the story of 1,000 hard rides and difficult decisions. His hands, though capable of signing checks that could buy entire businesses, were still calloused from rope and leather. The men who worked for him respected him not just because he paid fair wages, but because he never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Yet there was a loneliness about Buck Richardson that all his money couldn't remedy. He'd never married, never had children, and as the years accumulated, he'd begun to wonder if his sprawling empire would amount to nothing more than a monument to solitude. On this particular February evening, Buck sat in his study, a massive room lined with books and decorated with the heads of elk and buffalo he'd hunted in younger days. A fire roared in the stone fireplace, and a glass of whiskey sat untouched on the desk before him. He was reviewing ledgers, calculating losses from the brutal winter, when he heard something unusual, a sound so faint he almost dismissed it as the wind. But then it came again, more insistent. Someone was knocking on his door. Buck frowned. Nobody traveled in weather like this unless they had no choice. He pushed back from his desk, his boots echoing on the hardwood floors as he walked through the grand hallway to the heavy oak door. When he pulled it open, a gust of wind-driven snow burst into the house, and with it came a sight that struck him harder than any Montana winter ever could. Standing on his porch was a young woman, perhaps 25 years old, with 2 small children clinging to her skirts. They were dressed in clothes that had once been respectable but were now threadbare and inadequate for the killing cold. The woman's shawl was dusted with snow, her face red and raw from the wind, and her eyes held a desperate exhaustion that spoke of miles walked and hope nearly extinguished. The little girl, no more than 5, had tears frozen on her cheeks. The boy, perhaps 7, tried to look brave but couldn't stop his small body from trembling violently. The woman raised her hand, preparing to knock again, and when she saw Buck standing there, something broke in her expression, relief mixed with fear, hope tangled with shame. Her lips moved, trying to form words, but the cold had stolen her voice. She swayed slightly, and Buck realized she was moments away from collapse. "Come in, ma'am," he said, his voice gentle despite his gruff appearance. He didn't ask questions, didn't hesitate. He simply stepped aside and gestured them into the warmth. "Quickly now, before you freeze solid on my doorstep." The woman stumbled inside, half carrying, half dragging her children. Buck shut the door against the howling wind and immediately began barking orders to his housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, a Chinese immigrant who'd worked for him for a decade and ran his household with quiet efficiency. Within minutes, the woman and her children were ushered into the sitting room closest to the kitchen, where the heat from the stove could reach them. Blankets were brought, hot soup was prepared, and Buck himself knelt before the children, carefully removing their frozen boots and wrapping their small feet in warm towels. "What's your name, son?" Buck asked the boy, his rough hand surprisingly gentle. "Thomas, sir," the boy whispered, his teeth still chattering. "Tommy. And this is my sister, Lily." "Well, Tommy and Lily, you're safe now. Mrs. Chen here makes the finest beef soup in Montana, and I expect you to eat at least 2 bowls each. Can you do that for me?" The children nodded, their eyes wide with wonder at the grand house around them and the imposing but kind man before them. Buck turned his attention to their mother, who had finally stopped shaking enough to speak. "I'm sorry, sir," she began, her voice hoarse and broken. "I didn't know where else to go. We've been walking since morning, and when I saw your lights—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Tears spilled down her cheeks, tears she'd probably been holding back for hours, maybe days, maybe longer. "No apologies necessary, ma'am," Buck said firmly. "You did exactly right. Now, before anything else, you need to warm up and eat. Then you can tell me your story, if you're of a mind to. But first things first, we take care of the immediate needs." Her name was Sarah Mitchell, and her story was one Buck had heard variations of too many times in the harsh Montana territory. She'd been married to a homesteader named James Mitchell, a good man with more ambition than luck. They'd claimed a quarter section of land 30 miles east, built a modest cabin, and tried to scratch out a living raising crops and a few cattle. For 3 years, they'd managed, barely, living on hope and hard work. Then, last autumn, James had been helping a neighbor repair a barn roof when he'd fallen. The injury seemed minor at first, but infection had set in. Without money for a proper doctor and with the nearest town 2 days' ride away, James had lingered for 3 agonizing weeks before dying, leaving Sarah alone with 2 small children, dwindling supplies, and winter approaching. Sarah had tried to manage on her own. She'd sold what she could, stretched their provisions as far as possible, and burned every piece of furniture that wasn't absolutely necessary to keep them warm. But the blizzards came early and fierce that year. Her small store of firewood ran out. The few chickens she had froze in their coop. And when the cabin's roof partially collapsed under the weight of snow, she'd made the desperate decision to walk to Silver Creek, hoping to find work, charity, or at least shelter until spring. "The cabin's gone now, I suppose," she said quietly, staring into her soup bowl. "Everything we built, everything James worked for, all of it buried under snow or blown away. I've got nothing to offer you for your kindness, Mr. Richardson. I heard your name from travelers passing through. They said you were a hard man but a fair one. I'm willing to work, to do anything, cooking, cleaning, mending. I can't pay you back with money, but I can work." Buck listened in silence, his face unreadable. He'd built his fortune through calculated decisions, weighing costs against benefits, risks against rewards. But sitting there, looking at this young widow who'd walked through a blizzard to save her children, he wasn't thinking about profit margins or return on investment. He was thinking about his own mother, who'd raised him alone after his father died in the Civil War, who'd worked her fingers to the bone to give him a chance at life. He was thinking about all the times someone could have helped them and didn't, all the doors that had closed in their faces, all the cold nights when charity would have meant the difference between survival and surrender. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said finally, "I'm going to make you a proposition, and I want you to listen carefully before you answer. You and your children will stay here until spring. That's not negotiable. I won't have it on my conscience that I turned a woman and 2 young ones out into this weather. During that time, you'll help Mrs. Chen with the household work, but only as much as you're able. Your first job is to rest and regain your strength. Your second job is to make sure those children get healthy and stay that way. Come spring, if you want to move on, I'll help you get wherever you want to go. But I've got another offer for you to consider." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I need someone to manage the domestic side of this ranch. Mrs. Chen is getting older, and while she won't admit it, the work's getting harder for her. I need someone to help her, eventually take over when she's ready to retire. It's a permanent position, with a fair wage, room and board for you and your children, and stability. There's a cottage on the property that's been sitting empty, 3 bedrooms, stone fireplace, real sturdy. It's yours if you want it. The children could grow up here, get proper schooling. I bring a teacher out from Silver Creek 3 times a week for the ranch hands' kids. They'd have a future, Mrs. Mitchell. A real one." Sarah stared at him, unable to comprehend what she was hearing. "Why would you do this?" she whispered. "You don't know me. I could be anyone." Buck smiled, a rare expression that softened his weathered features. "Ma'am, I've spent my whole life judging character, in horses, cattle, and people. A person's true nature comes out in how they handle hardship. You walked 30 miles through a blizzard to save your children rather than give up and wait to die. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. Besides, he added, his voice taking on a gruff tone to hide the emotion beneath, this big house gets awful quiet with just me and Mrs. Chen rattling around in it. Might be nice to hear children's laughter again. Sarah Mitchell did stay, first through that brutal winter, then through the spring thaw, and then permanently. The cottage Buck had mentioned became a real home for her and her children. She proved to be everything he'd hoped for and more, organized, hard-working, with a warmth that gradually transformed the grand but lonely ranch house into something that felt like a home. Mrs. Chen, initially skeptical of the arrangement, came to treasure Sarah like a daughter. The two women worked together seamlessly, and when Mrs. Chen finally retired 5 years later, it was with the satisfaction of knowing the household was in capable hands. Tommy and Lily Mitchell grew up on the Double R Ranch, thriving in ways they never could have in that isolated homestead cabin. Tommy learned ranching from Buck himself, absorbing not just the practical skills but the ethics and principles that made Buck respected throughout the territory. He eventually became Buck's ranch foreman, managing operations with the same integrity his mentor had shown. Lily, bright and curious, devoured every book in Buck's extensive library and eventually became a schoolteacher herself, educating the next generation of ranch children. As for Buck Richardson, the lonely millionaire cowboy found something his money could never buy: a family. He never formally adopted the Mitchell children, but in every way that mattered, they became his. He taught Tommy to ride and rope, to read the weather and the land, to treat everyone with respect regardless of their station. He encouraged Lily's love of learning, ordering books from back east, discussing ideas with her as she grew older, funding her teacher's training. And in Sarah, he found a companion whose strength matched his own, someone who understood hardship and perseverance, someone who made his house feel less empty. Years later, when Buck was an old man, sitting on his porch and watching Tommy's own children play in the yard, a traveling journalist asked him about his success, about how he'd built such an empire. Buck thought about it for a long moment, then said, "I made a lot of money in my life, son. Some good deals, some lucky breaks, some hard work. But the best decision I ever made cost me nothing but a little kindness on a cold winter night. Sometimes the greatest investment isn't in land or cattle or gold. Sometimes it's just opening your door when someone knocks." The story of the poor widow who knocked on the millionaire cowboy's door became legend in that part of Montana. People told it around campfires and dinner tables, a reminder that prosperity means nothing without compassion, that true wealth is measured not in dollars but in the lives you touch and the family you build. And every winter when the snow fell heavy on the Montana plains, folks would remember Buck Richardson and Sarah Mitchell, and they'd make sure to keep their own doors unlocked, their own fires burning bright, just in case someone in need came knocking through the storm.